Today, the session will be chaired by John Purcell, Policy Advisor from CPA Australia. I would also like to acknowledge that we are joined by the CPA Australia Deputy President of the Board, Professor Dal Pinto, FCPA. Thank you for joining us, and Professor Pinto will now say a few words. Over to you.
Great. Thank you for that welcome, Helen, and a very warm welcome, everyone. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land from around Australia and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And I extend this acknowledgement to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today. On behalf of the board, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to everyone who has joined us for today's webinar on the important topic of climate change, modern slavery, and the Sustainable Development Goals. Before we delve into the discussion with Dr. John Purcell, Professor Nava Subramaniam, and Dr. Leanne Morrison, I would like to make a special acknowledgement on behalf of the board. This webinar marks a very special occasion as after more than 2 decades with CPA Australia, Dr. John Purcell, FCPA, Senior Manager, Environmental, Social and Governance, is farewelling our organisation. John has been at the forefront of CPA Australia's ESG policy and advocacy work, setting a terrific example of pursuing excellence by developing strategy, conducting research, and advocating for positive change for the past 23 years, quite a legacy. Some of John's most recent achievements include facilitating CPA Australia joining with leading global accounting bodies in committing to net zero greenhouse gas emissions, delivering our modern slavery statement published in May this year, and his continued presence at global conferences such as the Prince of Wales Accounting for Sustainability Project, or A4S, and in the Commonwealth Climate Law Initiative. All remarkable achievements, John. After retiring, John doesn't plan on relaxing just yet, as he welcomes this milestone as a transition to more targeted activities that he intends to undertake in the ESG space. John's contribution to CPA Australia and more broadly to the profession and its global impact in ESG is enduring and will continue to be highly valued and recognised into the future. On behalf of the Board of Directors and all members, a most sincere thanks to John as we wish him all the very best in his retirement. On a personal note, John, it's been an honour to work with you while I've been on the board. You're a very thoughtful and knowledgeable person, and I wish you all the very best for your future endeavours. Thank you everyone for joining us. It's going to be a wonderful session. And with that, I'd like to hand over to John. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dale, for those particular kind words. I am indeed most flattered. It has been a huge privilege for me to have worked with CPA Australia in what has been truly groundbreaking work, and I'm most confident that under the leadership of the board and the management of CPA Australia, the organisation and the profession more broadly is extremely well placed to address the challenges ahead of us in the area of environmental, social and governance. And it is through work such as that done by Professor Subramanian and Leanne Morrison, which adds particularly to our arsenal of resources and thought leadership, which will drive the profession forward in the coming decades. It is now my pleasure to invite Dr. Nava Subramaniam and Leanne Morrison into this webinar. Some brief background information on Nava and Leanne, who I've had the pleasure of working with for some time now. Nava is Professor of Accounting in the School of Accounting, Information Systems and Supply Chain, RMIT University. Her research interests cover corporate sustainability and governance, sustainability development goals, management controls and assurance, and the accounting profession. She holds several prestigious grants from the Australian Research Council and industry and professional organisations. Her recent industry studies cover measurement and disclosure of the SDGs by Australian businesses. And I would indeed say that we have a further piece of work coming from Nava in this area, which will be released early next year. Nava's research work has been published in numerous high-ranking journals, such as Management Accounting Research, Journal of Accounting and Public Policy, AAAJ, the International Journal of Accounting, Accounting and Finance and Ethics. She is a CPA and a member of the editorial board of AAAJ, IJA, and the Journal of Business Managerial Auditing, Journal, and the Accounting Forum. Nava has held sustainability responsible research centre directorships at RMIT, Deakin University, and Griffith University. She is also an adjunct professor at Amrita University in India. Dr. Morrison Leanne is a accounting lecturer in the School of Accounting, Supply Chain and Information Systems, and the lead for the Climate Change and Environment at the RMIT Business and Human Rights Centre. Her research focuses on the role of accounting in society, particularly the interaction between organisations, the natural world, as communicated through corporate environmental reporting, more of which we'll hear about later. She has recently published a book about the ways in which Western culture has identified with nature over time and is highly engaged in climate change policy environment with the business community in Australia. Leanne has held a number of board positions in the environment not-for-profit sector. Prior to joining RMIT, Leanne lectured on a range of accounting topics at the University of Tasmania, where she gained her PhD in corporate environmental reporting. Today, we'll be taking questions through the QA box. Please direct questions to all panellists, and we'll address questions at the conclusion, and we'll do our best with time remaining to cover these. For any troubleshooting queries, please send a message to the host box in the chat box. It is now my pleasure to hand over to Professor Subramaniam. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would also like to acknowledge the Aboriginal people of the nation and also their elders past, present, and emerging leaders. Thank you, John. Thank you, CPA Australia, for organizing this webinar and for the invitation. And I'd also like to add my deepest appreciation to John, who has been a fantastic leader in this space, and for giving us academics a leg up and support and guidance in the area of social and sustainability in general. So time is limited, and it's an area, a passionate area of research for me. So I will get started with the introduction to SDGs. I'm sure many of you would have heard about the SDGs. These are 17 Sustainable Development Goals that the 193 United Nations member states have agreed to in relation to sustainable development. And these goals are to be achieved by 2030. And the goals, the 17 goals, while not being exhaustive in any sense, they were derived by a long and big process of discussion, collaboration, and by all 193 states. And it represents a blueprint, bringing people, planet and prosperity, balancing all of them to achieve sustainable development. And important to those 3 P's are two more P's, which is peace and partnerships as well. One of those goals relates to climate action. One of the things about the Sustainable Development Goals, as you can see, is that they are actually interrelated. So I will talk about the interrelations and what that means for climate action in a minute, in a bit. But the SDG 13 on climate action is an important goal that globally 193 nations have agreed to, that we need to do something about climate. The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres said in a recent UN Global Compact Leaders Summit that the central objective of the United Nations for 2021 is to build a truly global coalition for carbon neutrality, and that he firmly believes that 2021 can be a new kind of leap year, the year of quantum leap towards carbon neutrality. However, since COP26, a gathering of the United Nations states, where the climate change sort of agreement to take action on climate change, the meeting happened in November in Glasgow. Since then, the pledges were made at COP26 on climate action. And the Climate Action Tracker, which is an independent body that scientifically assesses and tracks the progress of nations on their climate carbon emissions, etc., find that actually in COP26, the pledges made for net zero might be a bit optimistic. In fact, it's quite grim. What they are saying is the Climate Action Tracker is saying is that even with all the carbon emissions reduction target pledges and actions to be taken on climate change, global greenhouse carbon emissions in 2030 will still be around twice as high as necessary for the 1.5 degree limit, which is our target to set according to the Paris Agreement goal. So we basically the world cannot take more than 1.5 degrees increase in temperature. Furthermore, the Climate Action Tracker also says with 2030 pledges alone, without longer-term targets, global temperature increase will be at 2.4 degrees Celsius in 2100. So this is pretty much, and I could go on to give you more details, but basically the point here is that the news looks fairly grim, that we do need a global action on climate action. So coming back to the SDG 13 on climate action, which is taking urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts, what we have is globally about 5 targets agreed to by all nations. So these SDGs come with targets and indicators. So SDG 13 has got 5 targets and 8 indicators that have been agreed to by the UN nations. And let's have a look. I'm just going to give you a sample because there's a lot actually in it and we don't have time to go into enormous detail. But if you look at target 13.1, for instance, strengthening resilience and adaptive capacity to climate-related hazards and natural disasters in all countries. Okay, so that's a target. How the SDGs nominate one of the indicators to measure progress on that target is looking at deaths and injuries from natural disasters. So indicator 13.1.1 is the number of deaths, missing persons, and directly affected persons attributed to disasters per 100,000 population. So target 13.2 is another example. So with this target, it's about integrating climate change measures into national policies, strategies, and planning. Now, the indicator for that is number of countries with nationally determined contributions, long-term strategies, national adaptation plans, strategies as reported in adaptation communications, and national communications. So as you can see, these targets and indicators are very much expressed at national level policy terms. Now, the action on climate change requires actions from different sectors, not just the government, not just the public sector, but also business. In fact, the SDGs are seen to be reliant on businesses to take action on those various goals. So in our study of how businesses in Australia, especially the top ASX 150, approach SDGs, we have found that climate action SDG 13 is one, if not the most common or popular SDG that is cited in the annual reports of Australian public listed companies. So this study that has been undertaken by myself with 4 other colleagues, that is Dr. Soraya Akbar, Dr. Sophia J, Dr. Renzo Mori, and Dr. Hoi Situ. I take this opportunity to thank them for their efforts as well. But it was a study that has been undertaken over 3 years. And we tracked the disclosure on SDGs of the top 150 ASX listed firms, and this is what we find, that climate action is right up on top as the most commonly referenced SDG. So that's kind of good news, because that shows that our top Australian companies are paying heed to SDG 13. In the last year, we had taken 150 annual reports, the 2020 annual sustainable reports of the 150 Australian firms, and we looked into, in particular, the carbon neutrality, the approach they have taken to carbon neutrality. And the news is not that so great here. What here, our findings here suggest is that the carbon neutrality is acknowledged only by 42% of our sample firms. Mind you, these are 150 top public listed Australian firms as at 30th June 2018. So out of the 150 top public listed public listed Australian firms, only 63 companies, 42%, have declared in their sustainability report as having either committed to or have achieved carbon neutrality. The 2020 annual sustainability report also shows that of these 63 companies, 17 companies disclosed as having achieved carbon neutrality. So if you look at 150 companies, look at 70, it's just a little bit more than 10%. Not so great news. And definitely companies can do better in actually having reached carbon neutrality. There are 38 companies that have declared their commitment to achieving carbon neutrality by at least by 2050. Okay. Of the 38, 15 said they will reach carbon neutrality or at least commit to reaching carbon neutrality by 2030. Then we have another 8 companies that have expressed commitment to carbon neutrality without setting a time frame for achieving the goal. So it's like we'll get there. We'd really like to do something about carbon neutrality, we do commit to it. It kind of, it's not a strong, firm commitment and doesn't look they actually have a strategy anyway. So in some senses, it's good to see that Australian companies are starting to declare carbon neutrality, but more can be done, obviously. So interestingly, while 87 companies were found not to have mentioned their intentions on carbon neutrality in their sustainability reports, 38 of them had actually prioritized SDG 13 as SDG 13 on climate action. So there is, in other words, a schism between how companies declare they want to support SDG 13, but then they're not mentioning anything about carbon neutrality. So I think there needs to be some maturity happening among Australian public listed companies in any case. So we do have challenges. We had looked at some of the strategies to reach carbon neutrality that has been disclosed by the top 150 Australian companies. And what we find is a most common one is using carbon offset. There is there's evidence of bringing actual carbon emissions down, but a very popular one that road to carbon neutrality is adopting or utilizing offset projects. But there's a challenge there because the concern is, are we delaying real emissions reduction? Okay. Heathrow Airport, for example, pays for peat bog restoration as an offset to contribute to carbon neutrality in the airport operations. Major oil company has promised expensive forestation to offset its operational emissions. Also, a big concern, and I wearing an auditor's hat. I used to be an auditor in past life. The accuracy and legitimacy of these offset programs have also been questioned. The need for appropriate financial incentives for negative emissions, or rather than relying on a general carbon price, has also been expressed and debated as well, carbon prices. So such a political space. So what I'd like to highlight today before I finish is, firstly, what needs to happen is the focus on SDG 13 alone on climate action is not enough. Australian firms need to also talk about SDG 7, which relates to clean and affordable energy and net zero emissions, more in sync with the relationship between energy and carbon emissions. Okay. The recommendation by the UN Energy Group, for example, says that there needs to be rapid transition to clean energy pathways. So rapidly scale up energy transition solutions to renewable energy by 2030, increase annual rate of energy efficiency from 0.8 to 3%, abandon all coal plants in the pipeline, and reduce coal power capacity by 50% by 2030. To take these actions, we do need to consider the situation between developing and developed nations. And some of these actions on, for instance, better, clean and affordable energy is not affordable right now by many developing countries. So issue of, in a sense, SDG 10 on reduced inequalities pop up. How do we find a system to ensure that we all meet carbon neutrality and pulling everybody together and not put so much pressure on nations, developing nations in particular, on reaching carbon neutrality? COP26, post-COP26 highlights is that we need climate finance. So this is where the developed nations, I know there have been some big commitments made, but there needs to be bigger commitment made for climate finance. This is because technological breakthrough is a key answer, a key pathway to get to carbon neutrality. Technological developments are there, but it's a trial and error, lots of experimentation, and that costs money. And so climate finance is absolutely necessary. We need to look at the pledges, the threat of greenwashing, not letting, in other words, some of those corporations or businesses or organizations and even nations get away with not doing the right thing. So corporate disclosure and assurance, very critical. In fact, I dare say that accountants are in the center of many of these solutions. We need to get reliable data. We need to get data that can lead to innovative solutions. We need to find ways to translate our accounting system focus on short-term orientation, financial information and data orientation to long-term orientation, and moving qualitative non-financial data into usable formats. And so finally, I look forward to the next round of climate talks when November 2022, where in the meeting, the next COP meeting is going to happen in Sharm el Sheikh, Egypt, and ask the question, can we put the world on track for 1.5 degree increase or below 1.5 degree increase in the world temperature? The two people that you see, or two beans that you see here, the two polar bears, their lives actually depend on what we do. Thank you.
Nava. That was a wonderful presentation. So I'm going to take it from here. And I absolutely agree with Nava that accountants play a really central key role in addressing climate change issues into the future. So I'm Leanne Morrison, as John introduced before. So I'm joining you today from unceded Wurundjeri country and extend my respects to Indigenous elders past, present and emerging. I would also like to thank CPA Australia for their support of this project, and thank Dr. John Purcell specifically for his support and also his incredible contribution to the accounting discipline and profession. Let me see if I can work these slides. Yep. So as a bit of introduction and background to this project, the report is available on the CPA website, and really the whole project arose from concerns about that nexus between Australian businesses and climate change. So in the context of global agreements, just as Nava has been discussing, so agreements such as the 2015 UN Paris Agreement, whereby most countries in the world agreed to reduce their emissions to a point that would limit average global increase in temperature to 1.5 degrees higher than pre-industrial levels, or 2 degrees at most. And to align Australian emissions with this goal, the Australian federal government has aimed towards net zero by 2050, and to get there at roughly the midway point, 2035, we should be at 26 to 28% below 2005 emissions levels. So just giving you some broad background information here. Then at the recent COP26 in Glasgow, most countries in the world agreed to further tighten those targets, given that it seems apparent now that those previously set would not be sufficient to limit global temperature increases to 1.5 or even 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. However, these agreements were made by governments, so I'm very interested in how business fits into that nexus, into that context. So there are a lot of ways we can cut and slice global emissions statistics by country, industry, by region, etc. But if we really look at the source of the global and Australian emissions, we know that around 70% are emitted by large companies. So with the weight of that level of responsibility, we see that most of those companies are reporting on climate change issues, as Nava reported as well. So it might seem that companies are addressing their climate change responsibilities, and if so, we would see a decrease in emissions. In accounting, we often see an equivalence between reporting and action. If a company is reporting on something, they're delivering a sense of accountability. But that's only part of the truth. As we know, accountability also involves some action, some doing something. So look away now if you're a sensitive soul. This graph is pretty disturbing. So if we look here, the red line at the top represents Australia's historical emissions. So as you can see, compared with 1990, there has been some reduction. But this isn't a trajectory towards net zero by anyone's standards. Some additional information to help us make sense of this chart. So the minor reduction that we can see in the red line, that reduction is primarily due to changes in land use. So basically where landowners have told the government that they won't clear land and therefore that land will absorb more carbon. But emissions from corporate activity, such as energy generation, have actually increased over that period. To me, though, that's not the most disturbing thing about this chart. If you look at these blue lines here, you'll see that they land on 2035 and 2045 along the x-axis, and not 2050, the year that's being touted by the federal government as the year that we reach net zero. The reason is based on research undertaken by the Climate Targets Panel, which has involved the same scientists who calculated Australia's initial targets and some of Australia's leading climate scientists. They say that we've already spent so much of our carbon budget that in order to adhere to the Paris Agreement, we would have to aim for a net zero sometime between 2035 and 2045. So these blue lines represent some really drastic changes in our whole economy. And we can see from this graph, the longer we leave serious climate action, the steeper those lines will get. That represents the speed at which Australia would have to transition to a low or no carbon economy. This little orange line there is the projection of what our emissions will be in 2030 if we continue as is, as we're going now. So I find that that graph pretty disturbing. But against this backdrop, let's look at what businesses are doing. So we have 60% of the ASX 100 reporting on climate and using a number of different frameworks to do so. So companies are reporting against the TCFD recommendations, which is the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures recommendations, the Global Reporting Index, and the SDGs, as Nava has discussed. But despite this reporting activity, we still have that chart that we just saw. So there's a clear disconnection between the reporting and the action on climate, which is really a key focus of this project. And that disconnection is further demonstrated or highlighted by the myriad of sustainability prizes and awards, where it's often the highest emitters that are getting the best reports, that are producing the best quality reports. So clearly some changes need to occur, as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, has called for, with increasing urgency over the recent years. So we're all aware of this. We're all, aware of the urgency of climate change. But how can we examine this problem, this situation, to find solutions? So that's what I'm looking for in this project. So focusing on not just the reporting, but also the performance and looking at that, the relationship between those things. So in doing so, I wondered whether climate-related KPIs might be part of the problem. So specifically, this project asks, what is the effect of climate change-related KPIs on corporate carbon emissions levels? In order to discover this, to examine this issue, I sat down with senior climate change and sustainability managers of ASX 200 companies, and we discussed these issues in great depth. These people are also deeply concerned about climate change and looking for solutions. So these interviews were highly insightful. I also examined the climate reporting practices of these companies, looking for particular patterns of language and to see how climate change was being reported. Then I dug a little deeper and focused on the climate targets or KPIs of the companies, those used internally for managers and departments, and also those reported externally. What I found when I spoke to those senior managers who oversee climate change responses for the ASX 200 companies was that there was a huge variation between companies in terms of how they address climate change and also how they measure and report on those issues. And there were also a range of motivations for doing so, from the TCFD recommendations, the Paris Agreement, industry norms was actually a really powerful force, and other stakeholder pressures. Not one of these managers told me that federal government policy had informed their response to climate change issues. In fact, overwhelmingly, these managers were wholly dissatisfied with the lack of guidance from the federal government. And another important factor that I noticed when talking with these managers was that the internal climate-related KPIs were fairly opaque, even to them. despite being the key person overseeing the climate change issues within the company, many of them gave fairly vague responses to these questions, and none could clearly point out how the internal KPIs related to the overall company targets, let alone any national or global targets. So when I took a closer look at how the targets are being reported externally, I found that if a target was mentioned, which was the case in all of the sample companies, it was one of these four. So first, often a company-specific target was used with no mention of if or how the company's target related to the Paris Agreement, federal government target, or any other larger target. This type of target seemed more in line with what the company itself deemed achievable, and a company-specific target also often related only to a specific aspect of operations, such as the offices or specific departments. Next, I saw the term science-based target being used in the reports, and when I looked into what this term means, I found that science-based targets is an organisation which assists companies to calculate how to reduce their emissions in line with the Paris Agreement. There were some problematic questions raised here and a high degree of scepticism from the interviewees about that organisation. And then the TCFD was also fairly frequently mentioned in relation to a climate target. The TCFD isn't itself a target. However, it does recommend that if a company is using the TCFD as a guideline, that a target in line with the Paris Agreement should be reported. So I therefore considered the TCFD as a proxy for a type of target. It's important to note also that these targets were discussed in relation to Scope 1 and 2 emissions and not Scope 3. Very few companies are reporting on Scope 3, none in my sample, and only one of the interviewees told me that their company had begun to calculate them. Most found the idea of calculating and reporting on Scope 3 to be too unwieldy. Here we can see the proportion of companies which had used one of those targets in their reports or made a commitment to do so. And you can see that a company-specific target, that bottom section, and the TCFD, the top item, were the most frequently used targets, although a significant number of companies reported a commitment towards adopting targets in line with the Paris Agreement as well. So how were these targets effective? How could we measure that? So you'll remember that in this project, I was concerned with the relationship between reporting and performance. So for that, I compared the level of emissions by each company over the previous reporting period to find whether emissions had increased or decreased and by how much. And when this data was compared with the target adopted by each company, I found that companies which had adopted the TCFD recommendations had the strongest link with emissions reduction over that period. And in comparison, those companies which had adopted their own company-specific target had the strongest link with emissions increase. So when I examined all of this data together from the interviews, the reports, the targets, and the global context as well, it seemed that there's an ideal relationship between the KPIs or targets of the company, its reporting, the national emissions, and global targets. So ideally, the internal or departmental emissions KPIs, including those associated with executive bonuses and departmental measurement of emissions, ideally, those would clearly link with the company's overall targets. Some of this seems like common sense, that's obvious, but it's not happening in the companies at the moment. So Ideally, also, those internal targets would necessarily involve the senior climate change or sustainability manager, the manager who's overseeing the company-wide emissions and climate change, the company's response to climate change issues, to ensure that link, that there's a link between the internal targets and the company's targets. So given that approximately 70% of Australia's emissions are emitted by large reporting entities, as we discussed earlier, it seems self-evident that it's crucial for company-wide targets then, so those that are externally reported, to be aligned with the national targets. The final crucial step in this ideal relationship would be for national targets to link with global emissions targets, such as the Paris Agreement or the more updated global agreements of COP26. What I found, though, in this sample instead was that at every step along this chain, the links were missing. So, for instance, the internal or departmental KPIs appeared to be only tenuously linked to the overall company targets, with climate change managers, the ones that I interviewed, often not having any oversight or even being aware of the specific KPIs for senior managers, how they related. Next, the company-wide targets were rarely in line with national targets. This isn't surprising since the federal government has left corporate Australia to fend for itself regarding this. As you'll recall, the managers I spoke to were calling for stronger federal climate regulation and policy to guide their strategy. And then, of course, in the next link, you'll already be aware of the problems of our national emissions targets and their tenuous link to global targets. So, as promised, some solutions, which I mentioned at the beginning of my, my presentation. So the recommendations which emerge from this project, there's 4 key recommendations, and they begin with a clear need for federal policy guidance. Most of these companies would appreciate any kind of climate guidance. It's actually a huge workload for each individual company and other businesses to be navigating this really complex terrain on their own. In the report, I recommend that federal policy is in alignment with the Climate Target Panel's calculations that I mentioned earlier, so that net zero really needs to be met by somewhere between 2035 and 2045 for Australia. Once those targets have been set, then robust policy needs to be implemented to support businesses in reaching those goals. That brings us to number 2. So once those reliable federal targets have been set, corporate emissions should then align with that target. There are a range of policy mechanisms which can be used to help businesses in that way, including setting a carbon price, a cap and trade system, and a robust carbon crediting system. The third recommendation that I make is a standardization of climate change reporting. So when examining the climate reporting of these companies, it was difficult to make a really robust comparisons between companies when each one tended to use its own methodology in preparing and presenting their emissions data and other information. So in the report, I also recommend that the GHG protocol and TCFD reporting would provide a robust basis for that standardization. So I was actually thrilled to hear at COP26 that the International Sustainability Standards Board is being established and that climate reporting informed by the TCFD will be standardized by the 4th quarter of 2022. My report also recommends the standardization of Scope 3 emissions, which is also a really important part of that ISSB remit that was announced at COP. So number 4, to assist companies to align their targets then. So we're looking at that kind of chain of events, chain of links between internal emissions and global emissions. So to assist companies to align their targets, their internal and externally, overall targets, the way that those links themselves should be disclosed. So in their publicly available reporting, this allows external stakeholders to assess the effectiveness of relevant internal targets and really to assess whether they link together and would logically lead to the overall company targets as stated, and then how they relate to the national targets, and then how those national targets relate to the global targets. So you'll recall that at the beginning of this project, I set out to ask, what is the effect of climate-related KPIs on corporate emissions levels? What I found was, yes, there is some effect. The TCFD is more closely aligned with emissions reductions than other targets. But I also found this much more embedded problem between the whole process of setting and linking KPIs, right from the internal KPIs through to the national and global targets. At every step, there's a sense of disjointedness. However, there's hope. There's mechanisms available to resolder those links and for Australian companies to be more actively contributing to those global targets and global solutions. So that's my presentation for today. So I see there's some questions in the chat, so I look forward to having a short discussion. We have a few minutes left, I believe.
Thank you very much, Leanne and others, both fantastic presentations. In the time remaining, yes, we're planning to pick up on some of those comments which have been put into the chat box, and let's sort of take the liberty of using some of those, particularly from David Nicholson, and probe some of the contentious issues and some of the challenges ahead for us. And firstly, there's reference there to full cost accounting and the inclusion of climate change and negative social actions in pricing. I was wondering, both Leanne and Nava, where firstly you see the developments such as those coming out of potentially out of the ISSB will address the extent to which we need to get externalities included in corporate reporting, and whether these methodologies would be an improvement, say, for example, what we had with things like true cost and the environmental P&Ls and balance sheets.
Oh, you're on mute, Nava.
I might start with the response there, John, because for me, as a researcher in this area, one of the biggest setbacks is having the right type of data to make decisions. As Leanne highlighted just then, that you need the link between setting the targets at a organizational level, linking it with, let's say, the national Australian national level, and then the global UN level, is difficult because of the lack in good quality data, and we need to find ways to actually measure non-financial impacts. Okay, so you could measure a lot of things by proxies, and proxies are always debatable, subjective, and the concern is that we may go down the road or path of being too quantitative and financially driven metrics that may not actually serve the good. So like, for instance, ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, the development is fantastic. It's high time we had one of those boards. However, they have not quite fully engaged with the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative Group, who have been leaders. And I think these parties need to come together and really talk about the double, materiality issue. You have to consider what's material financially and non-financially. I'll stop there so that Leanne can have an opportunity to
Yeah, your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks for this question, David. I really spend a lot of time thinking about this this issue. I think so many important things have been externalized from the balance sheet, and that's been a way to silence those issues and make them invisible. So there seems logically that to bring them into the balance sheet, to internalize those externalities, as you say, their negative social actions, climate change, those kinds of things, into a full cost accounting, that seems logical. And I think there's so much value in doing that, specifically because it financializing, if that's a word, those issues brings them into the heart of the corporation, the purpose of the corporation, and makes them highly visible. Some of the kind of cautions, I would say, around those externalities, Nava touched on that. The problems of quantifying very complex problems. Who gets to put a price on those things? Who gets to, value things like climate change or pollution or social harms? And then once they're financialized, once they've got a dollar value onto them, are they going to get pushed down so that they, become immaterial in the financial
Stage. We're back. Sorry, we had a break in communications, I think, Leanne.
Oh no, I said some such insightful things while I dropped out. I assure you. Yeah, I'm not sure what you caught of I'm not sure what you caught of that, but yeah, basically there's a lot of value and promise in internalizing those costs, but a lot of cautions and problems with doing so. A lot of things we have to be really careful about setting those values as well.
Yeah, it probably just pass back to you, if I could, Nava, and this idea of whether or not the SDGs help reshape the understanding of what the purpose of the corporation is.
Yes and no. I think the SDGs came into being with the hope that the benefits from the corporate world, particularly knowledge, technologies, corporations are great with good management capabilities of developing management systems. However, I think the problem is that the SDGs are not currently, my big beef is that they're not debated and discussed holistically, in an integrated manner. As I said, even in this area, there's a lot of focus on SDG 13, but not enough on SDG 7 and how the policies should align and support each other. Likewise, SDG 17, partnership is a very important SDG, because unless you have partnerships between public-private partnerships, for instance, they need to be revised. So it's not just about putting it all on business, but it's like bringing business, civil society, as well as public sector governments to work together for a common goal. So it is the politicization of issues in this area that, I think holds us back. Oops, I think John's having a bit of connectivity.
found this a very informative discussion. We do have a couple of
there is a question here that I see from Noel Yahanpa. To what extent incentives are effective in this process of carbon neutrality? So incentives, let's look at our direct action plan that, Australian government has taken, right, for climate action. How effective has that been? We don't know, we need to dig deeper, I think, in finding out how those incentives worked. Did it work for a political benefit, or did it work really at the cold front, the farmers, the people who are involved in those direct, the businesses that put in those tenders and, wanted to do things differently. So it's not to say, it's a very important question. Incentives are important. Our behaviors are generally incentivized by, some financial or some other type of gain. But I would say developing the right type of incentive would definitely be effective. What do you think, Leanne?
Yeah, great points, Nava. I think, rather than incentives sitting outside of any kind of economic system and being added in, I think in that sense, they can often be seen as a cost. That's a concern, especially in the political discourse about climate change. Not presenting these things as a cost, but trying to embed them into the whole economic system. As David suggested earlier, we're looking at full cost accounting. I think in that sense, some way for these issues to be like really genuinely embedded into the decision making, rather than as something that's kind of sitting outside or sitting on top of normal activities and normal decision making. So it depends what you mean by incentives. If it's part of, something like carbon pricing, where there's incentives to, or a cap and trade system where there's incentives not to emit as much, thereby avoiding costs. I think those kinds of incentives definitely would be effective, and part of a range of mechanisms that could be implemented.
Yeah.
Have we lost John altogether now?
No, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Obviously you've handled those questions with aplomb in my absence. I think we are at, we've exhausted our time. I want to thank you both very much for this significant contribution, both to the discussions here today and the policy insights and debate over the last 12 months, and certainly it is a foundation for further significant work as we move into 2022 and deal with the development of ISSB standards and the economic and social transformations that need to take place. I thank you both very much, most sincerely. So thank you.
Thank you, John. And thanks to everyone who attended, and Dale, and to Helen.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. And thanks to Professor Subramaniam and Dr. Morrison. And also thank you to everyone for your participation today. In the next 3 working days, you will receive an evaluation survey accompanied by the recording of this webinar. We really appreciate your feedback, as it is extremely valuable to CPA Australia to help us to deliver better events for you. Thanks again, and we look forward to welcoming you to another CPA Australia webinar soon. Hope you all have a lovely day. Bye.
Thanks,
Thank
Helen.
you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.